On the morning of January 17th, 1781, Banastre Tarleton pushed his tired British column through the cold backcountry of South Carolina toward a cattle pasture called the Cowpens, convinced that Daniel Morgan had finally made the mistake the British had been waiting for, because the Americans had stopped on open ground with no fort, no town, no heavy defenses, no swamp to shield their flanks, and the broad river several miles behind them, while the part of Morgan's army that British officers trusted least, the militia, stood out in front where the bayonets would reach them first. From Tarleton's saddle, the field looked almost too perfect. For months, the war in the South had been turning against the Americans. Charleston had fallen in May of 1780, taking thousands of Continental soldiers with it in the worst American defeat of the Revolution. Camden followed a few months later, and there the American army broke so badly that the road away from the battlefield filled with fleeing men, abandoned weapons, scattered wagons, and the wreckage of a campaign that seemed to be collapsing faster than George Washington could repair it from the north. British commanders believed that if they could crush the remaining Patriot forces, protect Loyalist militias, and keep pressure on the countryside long enough, the southern colonies might still be pulled back under British control. But the South was not like the North, and the war there did not move only through cities and formal battle lines. It spread through farms, roads, river crossings, churchyards, and settlements where neighbors chose opposite sides and remembered every killing. Patriot militia hunted Loyalists. Loyalists burned Patriot homes. British columns moved through the backcountry looking for supplies and obedience, while American partisans struck from woods and swamps, then disappeared before regular troops could bring them to battle. That was the war Nathanael Greene inherited when he was sent south to command what remained of the American army. Greene did not find a strong force waiting for him. He found hungry men, tired horses, thin supplies, and an army that needed time more than it needed one glorious battle. If he gathered everything together and lost, the South might be finished. So Greene divided his already weak army, forcing Cornwallis to divide his attention too, and sent Daniel Morgan west with a mixed force of Continentals, militia, riflemen, and cavalry to threaten British positions and pull pressure away from the main American army. Morgan did not look like a polished European officer, and he did not think like one. He had grown up poor on the Virginia frontier, worked as a teamster, hauled supplies through wilderness roads, fought in the French and Indian War, and carried scars from a brutal punishment he had received while serving with the British, when he was sentenced to hundreds of lashes after striking a superior officer. When the Revolution began, Morgan joined the American cause with the kind of experience that did not come from books. He had marched to Boston with Virginia riflemen, fought at Quebec, been captured and exchanged, and returned to help break Burgoyne's army at Saratoga, where his riflemen fought from cover, targeted officers, and used long rifles in ways that made British and German commanders furious because the methods were irregular, effective, and difficult to answer with parade ground discipline. By the time Morgan reached the Southern Theater, he had seen regulars fight, militia panic, riflemen disappear into woods, cavalry turn a retreat into a slaughter, and commanders ruin armies by asking men to do things they had never been trained to do. That experience mattered at Cowpens more than any formal education could have. Morgan understood militia in a way many officers did not want to admit. They were not useless. They were not simply cowards. Many could shoot well, move quickly, and fight hard when the job matched their training and their nerve. But they were not built to stand in an open field while British regulars marched toward them with bayonets fixed, drums beating, officers shouting, and the smoke thick enough that a man could no longer see whether the line beside him was still holding. That kind of discipline came from years of training, punishment, habit, and the confidence that the men on both sides would not run when the first gap opened. Most militia did not have that. Morgan did not pretend they did. The man sent to destroy him was almost built from the opposite material. Banastre Tarleton was young, fast, aggressive, and feared across the southern backcountry because he had turned speed into a weapon. He commanded the British Legion, a mixed force of cavalry and infantry that could move quickly and strike before its enemies had time to settle. At Waxhaws in 1780, his men became tied to the killing of Americans who were trying to surrender, and whether the details were repeated fairly or not, the name Tarleton became enough to frighten Patriot families and harden Patriot hatred. To the Americans, he was Bloody Tarleton. To Cornwallis, he was the officer most likely to catch Morgan before the Americans could slip away again. For days, the chase continued across winter roads, through mud, creeks, and rough country that wore down men and horses alike. Tarleton pushed hard because he thought exhaustion was worth the prize. If he could bring Morgan to battle and crush him, Cornwallis would remove a dangerous American detachment from the field and send a message through the backcountry that resistance was still punishable by destruction. Morgan understood that running forever would only weaken him, and if he tried to retreat across the broad river with Tarleton too close behind, the British might catch him at the crossing, where an army trapped at water with cavalry behind it could be ruined before it ever formed a line. So Morgan stopped at the Cowpens. The place did not look like a natural fortress. It was a grazing ground, open enough for cattle, open enough for infantry, and shaped by gentle slopes that mattered only if a commander knew exactly how to use them. There were no walls, no trenches, no town streets to choke the British advance, and the broad river behind the Americans made the position look even more dangerous to anyone who believed an army needed an easy line of retreat. Some of Morgan's own men worried that he had trapped them. Tarleton would think the same thing when he arrived. Morgan was counting on that. On the night before the battle, while Tarleton's men were still being driven forward through darkness and cold, Morgan moved through his own camp and spoke to the men who would have to make the plan work. He did not leave them with vague courage or complicated orders that would vanish once the shooting started. He explained where they would stand, when they would fire, where they would move, and why leaving the front line would not mean disgrace if they did it at the right time and in the right direction. The plan depended on men performing a retreat without turning it into a rout, and Morgan knew that no order written on paper could hold frightened men together unless they understood it before fear arrived. The militia would stand forward, where Tarleton would see them. They would let the British come close enough for the shot to matter. They would fire, reload, fire again, and then withdraw behind the line of Continental troops, waiting farther back. Morgan was not asking them to die in place or receive a bayonet charge they were not trained to meet. He was giving them a task that matched what they could do, and because the task was limited, clear, and survivable, it gave men who might have run in confusion a reason to move with purpose. Behind them, John Eager Howard's Continentals and dependable Virginia troops formed the stronger line, the men Morgan needed to hold when the British came in angry and disordered. Out front, riflemen and skirmishers would sting the advance before pulling back. Hidden farther behind the rise, William Washington waited with cavalry, positioned where the British would not fully see him until the battle had already drawn them in. Tarleton would be shown the kind of weakness he already believed in, and his own aggression would carry him toward the part of the field where Morgan's best troops were waiting. Before dawn, Tarleton's column was already worn down. Many of his men had marched through the night. Horses were tired. Infantry had been pushed hard over difficult ground. A more cautious commander might have paused, rested, studied the field, and made sure the Americans were not offering something too obvious. Tarleton did not. He had finally caught Morgan, and everything in front of him seemed to confirm what he wanted to believe. The Americans were on open ground. Their militia were visible. Their retreat seemed blocked by distance and water. Delay might let them escape. Tarleton ordered the attack. The British line moved forward across the cold pasture, and the first Americans they met were Morgan's riflemen. Shots cracked from the front of the field, and British officers and soldiers began to fall before the main lines had even collided. The riflemen did not stay until they were overwhelmed. They fired, pulled back, and moved toward the next line, as Morgan had arranged, giving the British the first taste of resistance without offering them a target they could pin down and destroy. Tarleton's men pressed on. Ahead of them stood the militia. This was the moment British regulars understood, or thought they understood. They had seen Americans in rough clothes before. They had seen militia fire and scatter. They had seen men who could shoot from trees lose their nerve when redcoats came forward in formation with steel at the end of their muskets. As the British closed the distance, the pasture began filling with the familiar sounds of 18th century battle, the shouted orders, the rolling drums, the uneven cracking of musket fire, the smoke drifting low over the ground, and the steady pressure of men advancing because the men behind them were advancing too. Morgan's militia waited long enough. Then they fired. At close range, the volley hit the British line hard, cutting into men who had expected the militia to break before they delivered anything so controlled. Smoke blew across the field. Officers shouted to keep the advance moving, and before the British could turn the first shock into momentum, the militia reloaded and fired again. The second volley did what Morgan needed it to do. It hurt the British, slowed them, and made the men in front of Tarleton angry enough to believe that one more hard push would finish the Americans. Then, the militia began to withdraw. From Morgan's side of the field, the movement had meaning. The men had done the job they were given. They were falling back toward the rear, moving behind Howard's line, where they could reform instead of being cut down by bayonets. But the British could not read Morgan's plan. From the other side of the smoke, they saw men in militia dress leaving the front. They saw backs turning. They saw a line giving way after 2 volleys, exactly the kind of thing British officers believed American militia would do when the real pressure arrived. Tarleton kept driving forward. This was where the field began to change, without the British fully understanding it. The pursuit that had made Tarleton feared now loosened the shape of his own attack. Men who thought they were chasing a beaten enemy pressed ahead faster than order could comfortably follow. The neatness of the advance began to fray. Units moved at different speeds. Officers tried to keep control while also exploiting what looked like a rout. The British were no longer simply attacking Morgan's first lines. They were being pulled toward the rise, where the men who had not yet broken were waiting. Howard's line stood behind the smoke. These were the troops Morgan had saved for the moment when Tarleton's men would arrive with their blood up, their formations stretched, and their confidence ahead of their caution. The British pushed forward, expecting the same collapse they thought they had just witnessed. Instead, they came into range of troops who had not spent the morning running from them, and who were waiting with loaded muskets on ground Morgan had chosen before the battle began. For a moment, even Morgan's line nearly produced the disaster he had been trying to avoid. As British pressure reached Howard's flank, an order was misunderstood, and part of the American line began to pull back. In a battle built around controlled withdrawal, the difference between an ordered movement and a real collapse could be only seconds wide. If the men behind the militia panicked too, Tarleton's charge might become the victory he thought he was seeing. But Howard's men did not dissolve. They turned, dressed their line, and fired at close range into British troops that had been moving forward under the belief that the Americans were giving way. The volley struck a formation already worn by rifle fire, militia volleys, and the strain of pursuit. And before the British could rebuild their shape, Howard's troops advanced with bayonets. At the same time, William Washington's cavalry came into the fight. The horsemen struck the British flank as Howard's infantry pressed from the front, and the men Tarleton had thought were leaving the field were no longer simply gone. Pickens's militia had moved behind the American line and was returning to the battle from a new position. The British advance, which had begun as a confident push against men they expected to break, was now being hit from directions Tarleton had not prepared for when he ordered the immediate attack. The collapse came quickly because everything that made Tarleton dangerous had carried him too far forward. His speed had denied his men rest. His confidence had denied him caution. His contempt for militia had made Morgan's withdrawal look like panic instead of design. By the time British soldiers realized that the men falling back had not left the battle, their own formations were already damaged. Their front was under pressure, their flank was threatened by cavalry, and the field that had seemed open and easy was no longer giving them space to recover. British soldiers began throwing down their weapons. Others fought in broken groups until they were surrounded. Officers tried to restore order in a fight that had already moved beyond their control. The guns were taken. The line that had come forward expecting to finish Morgan was now the one being broken apart. Tarleton escaped with only a portion of his mounted force, but his command had been wrecked. The battle lasted roughly an hour, and in that hour, one of Cornwallis's most useful striking forces was destroyed as an effective command. British casualties were severe, with more than 100 killed, hundreds wounded, and hundreds more captured or missing, while American losses were far smaller. The exact totals vary slightly by account, as they often do after 18th century battles, but the imbalance was unmistakable. Cowpens was not a narrow American success. It was a stunning British defeat, delivered in the very kind of open-field battle Tarleton had expected to win. Morgan had not needed his militia to become something they were not. He had needed them to do exactly what he had told them, and for Tarleton to misunderstand it. The same movement can look like panic to the man chasing it and discipline to the man who ordered it. And on that freezing morning in South Carolina, Tarleton saw only the version of the movement his past victories had trained him to see. The consequences reached beyond the bodies and prisoners left at Cowpens. Cornwallis could not easily replace the kind of troops Tarleton lost, especially the light infantry and cavalry needed to control the backcountry, chase American detachments, and protect British influence away from the main roads. The British Southern strategy depended on speed, intimidation, loyalist support, and the ability to punish Patriot forces before they gathered strength. Cowpens damaged that system at exactly the wrong time. It also changed the mood of the war in the South. After Charleston and Camden, the American cause had seemed battered and uncertain. After Kings Mountain and Cowpens, the backcountry no longer looked like ground the British could simply frighten into obedience. Patriot fighters had seen that British regulars could be defeated, that Tarleton could be beaten, and that the men who had seemed unstoppable could be trapped if they were made to fight on terms they did not recognize until too late. Cornwallis reacted by pushing harder. Determined to crush Greene's remaining army, he lightened his force, moved north, and drove his men through a punishing campaign that led to the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March. There, the British technically held the field, but the victory cost them heavily, and the army that had hoped to pacify the South was being pulled farther from its base, farther into exhaustion, and eventually toward Virginia, where the war would close around Cornwallis at Yorktown. Cowpens did not win the revolution by itself, but it helped break the rhythm of British success in the south, humiliated one of Britain's most feared officers, preserved Morgan's force, strengthened Patriot confidence, and forced Cornwallis into a series of decisions that made his army more vulnerable with every mile it marched. What happened at Cowpens was not that farmers somehow became professional soldiers for one perfect morning. It was harsher and more impressive than that. Morgan accepted the men he had, understood the enemy coming toward him, and built a battlefield around the behavior both sides were most likely to show under pressure. The militia would not stand forever, so he did not ask them to. Tarleton would chase what looked like a rout, so Morgan gave him one. The British would trust the lesson of Camden, Waxhaws, and every broken militia line they had seen before, and by the time that lesson betrayed them, the Americans were already firing from the next position. Today, the Cowpens battlefield is quiet enough that the shape of the ground can seem almost too gentle for what happened there. The pasture, the rises, and the distances between the lines no longer carry the noise that made them matter. But on January 17, 1781, those slopes held one of the most carefully timed reversals of the American Revolution, because Banastre Tarleton rode into the field believing Daniel Morgan had trapped himself, and for most of the battle, the Americans made sure he kept believing it. By the time he understood the mistake, his army was already coming apart. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.